Okay, here is part 4, and definitely the final section for this chapter, chapter 12, Perspectives on Environmental Policy. And this is about the final bit of deterrence for environmental polluters, as it were. And this is called deterrence via the legal system. So, we've already talked about command and control regulation, incentive-based systems. You might consider this the last step, the final straw. This is deterrence via the legal system. Um, Environmental policy loses its influence when enforcement mechanisms are weak. And the question is what to do about this. Your author has a story about Chemetco um, discharged pollutants via a to a tributary of the Mississippi River through a secret pipe. And the enforcement wasn't that great. And finally, they were sued, and the U.S. District Court ordered a fine of $3.8 million and $400,000 in restitution payments. Um, the individuals accused of building the secret pipes faced up to 8 years in prison and $500,000 in fines. So, some people take the risk to circumvent environmental regulations, and the threat of the fine can perhaps have them resist the temptation to pollute, to get rid of their waste materials. Okay, so this section goes into a little bit of what your author calls the theory of optimal deterrence. So it's not just the fine, it's what is the perception of the probability of getting the fine. And your author is going to call this something called the expected punishment cost. And here we go. So the expected punishment cost is the probability of punishment times the punishment cost if it is imposed. So, and then how is the probability of punishment calculated? And that itself is the product of the probabilities of apprehension, conviction given apprehension, and punishment given conviction. So, if let's say that we have a $10,000 fine, and if the chance of getting caught is 80%, if half of those folks are apprehended or convicted, and half of those convicted pay a $10,000 fine, and while the rest get a warning, the probability of punishment is only going to be 0.2, and the expected punishment cost is 0.2 times 10,000, which is only $2,000. So even if there was a $10,000 fine, if you take all those other things into consideration, in particular the probability of punishment, then the actual expected cost that one would be expected to pay would be only $2,000. And I think people make this kind of calculation a lot if they, let's say, park illegally, even when there is a fine. They're betting on the fact, even though the fine is there, they're betting on the fact that they will not get caught. In essence, they are placing some kind of probability of punishment along with the punishment cost, and then figuring out to themselves whether it's worth it to do the act or not. Now, monitoring cost minimization leads to high jury awards in environmental cases. It acts as a deterrent. So one way to get around this, shall we say, rational cost benefit is to have a very, very high punishment cost, and if you have a minimal cost deterrence, that could make some sense. table, I believe it's maybe 12.1, table 12.1. We have punishment alternatives based upon the probability. So you can have a punishment cost of $10 billion, I believe is the number, and a probability of 1 in a million. The expected punishment cost will still be $10,000. So this has led to very high punishments and very high jury awards in order to deter folks from polluting. And that also means that these need to be monitored a bit less, with the idea that the high jury award itself will act as a deterrent. Alrighty, one more slide. Oh, actually, two more slides. So here we have excessive deterrence, and what's going on here is, let's say a polluter is looking strictly at, first of all, the red line, the private marginal cost and the marginal benefit. So the polluter is only looking at the private marginal cost and the benefit. So they are producing too much. They're not looking at the social cost of their pollution. And you have Q private. So the government places a tax, a Pagoo tax, which would shift the supply curve to the left, giving us the purple line. But if you add litigation and litigation risk burden, that may actually lead to excessive deterrence. When there are legal remedies in addition to regulation, the result may be excessive deterrence. So the polluter or the firm may be producing too little. They are being very risk averse. So, and as shown by the graph. So, oftentimes we economists might say, if there is a tax along with litigation, that may act as a deterrent to otherwise okay production. You're overestimating the social cost, as it were. I think that's a good way of doing it, is that you're overestimating the social cost. An economist named Kip Viscusi, quote, advocating regulation as an alternative to litigation. And he says, one cannot rely on tort liability in lieu of regulation because product liability incentives are ill-suited to the task. Now, all injured parties file claims, and court awards are far below what is required to promote efficient safety incentives. In other words, what he's saying is we should have more focus on regulation and less on torts, because the actual awards are not nearly as big as they should be to have real good compliance. So yeah, we economists are not the greatest friend of the legal system and legal awards. Okay, final slide. Activism and vigilante justice. Here is a picture from your book on Animal Holocaust Museum of Death. And so this is, shall we say, private individuals engaging in acts of deterrence. Some activists have taken matters into their own hands. Your book describes private eco-activism that ranges from letters to politicians to violent acts of eco-terrorism, add to the landscape of incentives for socially responsible behavior. So this is an incentive to get producers to take social costs into consideration. So I just did that one. Let's say in 2001, the Anti-Urban Sprawl Earth Liberation Front (ELF) allegedly burned new homes using crude explosives, damaged bulldozing equipment, and scrawled "Meat is murder." And if you build it, we will burn it on a restaurant and a home. So this was a private vigilantes. I think there's been some animal rights activists that have done various things, sprayed blood on people who are wearing minks and other fur coats and such. And this is not necessarily, obviously, not government sanctioned. No taxation involved. It's just you have to fear these activists. You could even say this is a form of terrorism. Now, like litigation and prosecution, the threat of responses from activists poses a small risk of large cost, but with a vigilante twist. The costs are not coming from the government, the costs are coming from private individuals. We economists believe that these violent approaches are largely ineffectual. And this is a very, very key quote. For governments to cater to terrorists would be to invite more crime. So the government may not necessarily respond because they would treat it like terrorists. That if you do this, you will incentivize more terrorists to do the exact same thing. Alrighty, this finishes our chapter 12. Your author has a very, very good summary about this. I encourage you to read that, as with all the summaries in this book. And we finished with chapter 12. And I will do 13 in a little bit.